Hi, everybody. This is week 8, and this week I want to talk about this idea of the strategic imperative of training. And so I gave you a couple of readings in addition to the text. And in this lecture, what I want to emphasize is mostly what comes from the text, but um, I'm adding some. I outline the text, but I also add some thoughts that I think are really important when we talk about the strategic importance of training. So right now, let me shift gears because what I want to do is give you a housekeeping reminder. This is week 8. And so that means I have this lecture and the readings and a discussion question for you, which is going to be due at the end of the week of the 7th through the 13th. But then the next week, week 9, the week of the 14th through the 20th, is nominally the UNO fall break. So the fall break, if you were in class, the fall break actually takes into account the 15th and 16th of October. But what I want to do is I'm giving you a break for that week from lectures and readings. I am not giving you a break from work. I have something assigned for you, and that is the Unit 2 summary. That will be due on the 20th. So you won't have to engage in listening to my lecture for the week. You won't have to have any additional readings, although working on the Unit 2 summary will require you to review. What the Unit 2 summary is going to ask you to do is write a job description for this position we talked about previously, which was this social media director. And so what I'm asking you to do now is write an actual job description. I'm going to ask you to attach it as a document online, not just fill out the dialog box, and that will be the graded portion for week 9. So no discussion, no lectures, no readings, but you have something due in week 9. So please do keep that in mind. Okay, so as organizations, as nonprofit organizations, as government organizations, and even in the private sector, um, why do we train? And that's a really important question. We really train because this is something that is supposed to connect to overall human resources management strategies, such as succession planning, planning for who's taking over next, performance evaluations, quality management initiatives, and new employee onboarding and orientation. Right? So everything is connected. And again, we keep beating this drum that human resources management is supposed to be or needs to be strategic, not an afterthought. So training design, that is what we think training should look like, really depends on the position design, right? It depends on the jobs that different people are doing. It's really important to keep in mind that career development and training are not the same thing. So training is the systematic process by which employees learn some of the knowledge, skills, attributes, and other characteristics necessary to do their job. And they're going to have some of those things coming into the job, right? And that's part of this process too. But career development really is viewed as more of a continuous process, where we are constantly evaluating the abilities and interests of our people. We're working with them through feedback and evaluation to establish career goals. And then we're planning some developmental activities for them, really to relate to the needs of the organization and the needs of the employees. So the bottom line really is organizations that really take this seriously have to keep monitoring this system, just like you monitor any other system in your organization, right? Your computer systems, your software, your facilities, your donations, anything that you're monitoring is something that you consider to be of value. So training is of that value. So So what do I mean by the strategic imperative part? Because that's what I made the title of this lecture. That is, do training and career development actually match the long-term strategy of the organization? So in John Bryson's terms, where are we now, where are we going, and how do we get there? We have to know that as an organization. We have to have figured that out and be thinking that way. And so training really ought to fit into that paradigm. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of words on here, but I'm going to take these in order. So I wanted all these words to hit you in a confusing way first, but there's some method here, and it has to do with why we train. So you see that red dot appeared there at the bottom. If we're going to start talking about training, we have to disaggregate it down to the position level. So what portion of the organization's core competencies are delivered by this position? So when you start thinking about a position in the organization, which is not to say a human being, it is to say the position. So what portion of the organization's core competencies are delivered by this position, right? If you're a baseball team and you have a pitching staff, and some pitchers are starters, some pitchers are mid relievers, some pitchers are closers. There's more. I'm not that much of a baseball person, but you have in mind what you want pitchers to do. And so if you're a Major League Baseball team, you're going to go about recruiting pitchers to specific positions. So what are the core competencies that you want delivered by the position? So that drives the position expectations and designs, right? So you expect a position to deliver particular core competencies, and then you're going to design a position with expectations as an explicit part of that to deliver those things. That means necessarily, the next red dot there, that you come up with position competencies. So you're saying the person, whoever the person is that will fill this position, this person must possess these competencies in order to fill this position. So that's going to drive you, the fourth red dot there, to come up with really pre-employment knowledge, skills, and other attributes, right? How are you going to know what those should be? What are the competencies you want this person now that you're going to hire to possess? What are, for example, the education hurdles that you want this person to have already crossed? And that's really going to, even before you interview the first person, that drives you to come up with a position compensation range, right? What is this position worth to the organization in terms of its strategic value? In turn, that drives you to those two things up in the upper left-hand corner, your recruitment strategy, and then your onboarding strategy. So you're going to design a particular recruitment strategy based on everything that you did down there. And actually, once you hire a person, it's going to drive you to a particular onboarding strategy, right? Because onboarding, which is something that organizations struggle with mightily, really should fit the position. Some people are going to show up with a need for more onboarding than others. And it might be a function of the person you hired, but it is also a function of the position. That also drives some kind of progression strategy in the organization. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so here's what I mean by that. We've harped on this a little bit, how the jobs economy is changing, and I actually heard another statistic just the other day in a report on, I believe, NPR, that said something like 30% of the workforce is basically freelance, which seemed like a pretty percentage. So I'm not sure how verified that is, but it was interesting. Um, but every position in your organization, if you simply look at the position, is not the position that's going to start uh, at entry level and progress to executive director, right? Some might be, but others might not be. So do you have a strategy for progression just regarding the position before you've even laid eyes on the person? And so that finally, in the upper right hand corner there of my slide, is going to drive your training strategy and your career development strategy. And again, all we've looked at so far is the position and not necessarily the person in the position. But there's a disconnect here, right? Here's the disconnect. That the first proposition is that training and career development meet the strategic needs of the organization. So what positions are seen as growth positions? What is the planned ceiling for the position? And as you work your way back through that red dot chart on the previous slide, that's where I was going with that. Here's the disconnect. That training and career development meet the often unformed strategic needs and career goals of the individual. So when you hire an individual, you sit down and say, where do you want to be 5 years from now? Well, you might actually not care as an organization where they want to be 5 years from now, but why are you asking that? You're asking that to see if they have a strategic plan for themselves that is at least partially formed, and you're asking them to identify where they want to go in terms of progression to help you identify whether they're the right person for the progression that you have in mind for that position. That's the reason you ask that question. You want to understand what those possibly unformed strategic needs and career goals of the individual are. So, what are the goals of the individual themselves with reference to the position and the organization? Why does a person apply for a job? Lots of reasons, right? They need a job. It might be as simple as that. But it also might be that they see that job as something that will help them advance vis-a-vis their own goals, right? But does the individual want to grow with the organization, or is this a stepping stone? And do some people have goals in mind that can really only be achieved through changing organizations several times, and everyone's aware of that? If a person, if their goal, if upon graduating with an MPA degree, is to become city manager of a city with over a 100,000 population, they're not going to get that job right away. And so the open assumption is that that person, whatever job they're applying for, is going to move from position to position and probably not in the same city. So you're not going to get a job as the assistant finance director in the city of Ralston, Nebraska, which would be a hard job right now for those of you who follow the news, and end up being the chief of budget for Denver, Colorado. You're not going to do that at Ralston, Nebraska. So there is an expectation that that person is going to move, and that might inform training and career development. So that last bullet down there is it clear if organizational strategies and individual strategies are fully integrated, either fully or partially, I should say. Is there an integration and at least an acknowledgement that those may be two different things, but they matrix together with varying degrees of granularity? Okay, so in general, when we start talking about training specifically, here's what organizations should be thinking about. The training and development improves the skills of employees and develops their capacity to cope with the constantly changing demands of the work environment. The training can be targeted. You can target it to learn new job-specific skills, as in advanced onboarding, this is what you need to know to do this job, or to improve performance, right? To provide awareness of policies and compliance areas, or to adjust attitudes and behaviors. And so all those things can be done under the rubric of training. So all of this should be planned, which includes methods, design, and delivery, and measurement. And finally, you should really recognize that the employee themselves might have a hidden training agenda that you might not be able to recognize. And that relates back to their goals for themselves within the organization. So the first thing you should start out with is a needs assessment, right? So anytime you do a needs assessment of anything, what you're really saying is you're identifying gaps, right? That's what a needs assessment does. Here's what we need for training. Here's the capacity we possess. So somewhere in there, there's a gap. There might not be a very big gap, or there might be a very large gap, but that's what a needs assessment does for you. So this needs assessment goes back to actually identifying position by position and then reaggregating all that and figuring out what's currently being done and what needs to be done. And then also figuring out in terms of individual employees if performance deficiencies can be eliminated by training. So at the bottom here, there's this list from the chapter of all these things that are involved in this needs assessment, right? But again, what you're really looking for here are gaps, right? So you're doing analysis of several jobs. You're doing surveys of current employees and their supervisors. You're looking at performance evaluations. You're looking at criticisms and complaints you might get from employees and or clients. You're looking at changes in pending laws, regulations, or operating procedures. Those are the things that, if we go back to strategic planning, really set up your mandates or the things you must do. And then you're looking at requests for training, like employees who have said, hey, I'd really like to be trained on this particular aspect of the job. Now, so all of that assumes that you have the capacity to do those things. And that, in fact, depending on the size of your organization, might be a big if, having the capacity to actually do these things themselves. It also assumes that you have a strategic approach to some of these related aspects. So for example, performance evaluations. I mean, are performance evaluations used as a learning tool? Or are they used as something of an informal punishment tool? And that's a real question, right? Because you've all been in organizations where performance evaluations seem to be used as a punishment tool or as a way to fire people. Well, that, I would tell you, is the wrong use of a performance evaluation. It's actually the wrong use of standardized testing in K-12 education, as long as we're on that subject, because what evaluation should do is point to shortfalls and help you devise a strategy for filling those gaps. But again, your performance evaluation system should actually be used for supervisors and employees to identify gaps and then set goals for improvement. So all these things are really sources of data for performing a needs assessment. Okay, so here's the training process, and this is where it kind of turns into pedagogy, but it's important. And the chapter identifies these 5 fundamental steps, right? Developing objectives for your training, developing a curriculum of some type, and which leads to methodologies and techniques, and then delivering the training itself through some method, either in-house or outsourced, and then going back and evaluating. So often with evaluating training, we stop at, you just sat through an hour-long training and somebody says, oh, by the way, I work for XYZ Training Corporation, who your company hired, please fill out the critique. Well, it needs to move beyond that. You actually need to evaluate whether the training is leading to changes in your work processes. Okay, so what are objectives? Again, objectives ought to be linked, I should say, to the knowledge, skills, attributes, and other characteristics of employees, right, at the end of the training. So you will improve an employee's knowledge of System A through this training. There has to be a standard for measuring that. That's kind of goes back to the later, what we'll get to, evaluation, but there has to be a standard for measuring whether the delivery of that training is going to do that. So the objectives have to be specific, and you should actually have a means for developing objectives that are collaborative, meaning that you shouldn't just have, your overstressed training manager having to sit down and come up with all the objectives for all the training. Because training really, again, and I beat this dead horse, should be strategic, and it should meet the needs of the organization, not the needs of whoever in HR is the training manager. Okay, so this is where I think, and Pines mentions this in her chapter, but I think this is where, depending on the size of your organization, we start running into capacity issues, right? So how do you really want this information to be absorbed by the people? So here she talks about cognitive learning versus behavioral learning versus constructivism learning, right? So what do those things mean? Cognitive learning really is just something, a fact that I want you to know, right? So here are things you should know on this job. If I'm giving you Excel training, you should know how to manipulate your way through the spreadsheet. If I'm giving you behavioral learning, what I want you to do with that spreadsheet is to be able to develop your departmental budget and make it error-free and presentable within, 3 days of giving you a new budget assignment or something like that. And then constructivism learning, really what we're talking about is how we really want people to integrate this knowledge into their own lived experience, really, and their own construction of what constitutes reality in their experience, right? So that sounds real postmodern and everything, but really what we're really saying is that people do construct their own reality. It doesn't mean that if you jump off a tower, you're not going to break your bones. It means that in terms of our social life, we do actually tend to construct at least part of our own reality. But do we want training to become part of a person's reality? So an example of something less innocuous than Excel training and probably more current is sexual harassment, right? Because we are in the midst of the Me Too movement, which is something that probably should have come along a long time ago, in my opinion, but also some very prominent cases that demonstrate that a lot of people haven't learned the lesson. But so if we try to differentiate what kinds of learning we would offer employees on the subject of sexual harassment, you can see there's a difference between cognitive learning, that is telling someone to memorize the policy that these particular actions are examples of sexual harassment. You could get them to learn that. Then there's behavioral learning. You could actually, with threat of firing or other discipline, encourage employees not to engage in creating a hostile environment or not to engage in sexual harassment, but you have no idea whether that changes their mind about the subject of sexual harassment at all. But you could actually strive to change their thinking on sexual harassment. So you can see that the organization itself might want to construct different objectives for that kind of training. So how are you going to deliver this training, right? That's my last bullet. Here's where I start thinking about capacity issues for an organization. There's lots of ways to deliver training, in-house or off the job. Now, in either case, you're talking about expending resources for the most part. So, for example, technical training, specific software that your organization might use that might be off-the-shelf software that a lot of people in your industry use. Would you get training from the company that designs the software, for example? Vendor offerings. Again, so lots of vendors actually provide training for free sometimes. It might cost you to send someone to their offices in another city. But then you have things like motivational training events, right? So, organizations send their employees to hear motivational speakers and it costs them something. But you might see that as useful to the organization and as part of your training and career development. And then continuing education. So, for example, at UNO, we host the Certified Public Manager program for Nebraska. CPM is a national non-degree accreditation program for people who work in the public sector. Well, we get anywhere between, I guess, 10 and 20 students every year. They come to UNO once a month, I think, on weekends for continuing education on topics of interest to mid-level managers in the public sector. But it costs money for the agency to enroll a student. We have a Clerks Institute where we train city clerks in Nebraska, and we do that once a year usually in Kearney, as it turns out. But we host that for the state, and those clerks, their cities, towns, are paying for them to come. And then finally, things like networking events, right? Even those are learning opportunities for your employees. Okay, so how do we deliver the curriculum, right? So look at all this stuff. Actually, this is a description of teaching classes too, right? Lecture, role-playing, case studies, experiential exercises, audiovisual methods. Well, all those things, that whole list of things, and these come from the chapter, really should be driven by what is the subject matter and what do you hope to impart, in terms of what you want the employee to take away. Is this cognitive learning, behavioral learning? And that's going to really, that's going to drive your training delivery method, right? So often in the past, I suppose, but probably still currently, a lot of onboarding consists of, here's a stack of policy letters, 15 or 20 policy letters. Please read these. Okay, that's great. But some of that subject matter might actually be something that you would like to have more dedicated training to do. And, talk about role playing, using role playing, I should say, for delivering that kind of training. So really, this should be thought through. So the choice of methods really depends on the goals of the organization for the knowledge that you're hoping to impart. So when you deliver this training, look at all this list of variables that come from the chapters, right? I was kind of talking on this on the previous slide. So what's the content and the amount of information to be learned, right? So, I mean, the training might be something simple like, the last person out the office at night locks the door. Okay, you don't need to do a lot of training to impart that, but it might be a lot more complicated. And it might be so complicated that you'd probably like to do a pilot program before you fully expand it to your workforce. You might want to have built in an opportunity for participants to practice what they've learned. You might want to worry about retention and transfer. So when I say that, what that should prompt in your mind is that you have to create a deadline for yourself to go back later and evaluate whether that knowledge was retained. And finally, this last question: do trainees need the opportunity to practice the trained tasks on the job? If you're being strategic about your training, you're training to tasks that they are going to have the opportunity to practice. If it's something they do once a year, how are you going to handle retention of that knowledge? So this last broad or bold-faced bullet I put down here is what I think of when I talk about delivering training. Just what can or will your organization commit resources to? What can you commit to that speaks to your capacity? What will you commit resources to? That speaks to your willful allocation or reallocation of resources. So question one is, do you have the resources? Question two is, how are you going to allocate them? This step, I talked about this earlier. Often I had the impression working in the public sector that some of the training I received was basically, you have to be trained on this. Oh, and at the end of the training session, please take 10 minutes to fill out the critique. And that's the entire evaluation process. Okay, so at the end of this course, you fill out a course eval. At the end of every course, you fill out a course eval. And the university really wants you to do that. Fill out the anonymous course evals, because what the university theoretically uses those for are improving performance of instructors, but also evaluating whether they want to keep instructors around. It actually, for tenured professors, it plays in their retention as tenured professors. But really, it also is to identify whether the course is worth retaining. That is one of the prime reasons we do course evals. So measuring training really has organizational benefits beyond a critique that says, did you like this course? You're really wanting to know, in the strategic sense, whether or not this training actually is helping move forward the organization's strategy. Okay, so let me switch gears real quick. Career development. I said training and career development are not the same things. They are related. They are not the same things. Training is used to increase knowledge and skills for current positions. Career development is providing knowledge and skills to be used in the future, right? Career development prepares employees to meet future agency needs. And career development improves the skill levels and long-term opportunities for the present workforce. So what are we saying by that? What we're saying is career development really is a way of intentionally connecting the long-term goals for this position that the organization has with the long-term goals of the individual human filling that position, right? So the individual has career development goals. The organization has career development goals from the standpoint of its own strategy. Career development is the way you are trying to connect those two. And just real briefly, so this really kind of feeds into this idea of managerial and executive development, but this actually also feeds back to succession planning. One of the big problems in government, as well as in nonprofits, is a lack, I would say, of succession planning. It's not that it's completely lacking, but this has been identified in the literature as something that we haven't paid enough attention to. So, in previous lectures, I talked about the kind of the age, the chronological age of the workforce in government, which tends to be older on average than the rest of the working population. We've talked about, and you've talked about this, those of you who are in nonprofit concentration, talked about things like founder syndrome, where a founder starts an organization and then you're suddenly met with the need to replace that founder for whatever reason. Could be retirement, could be illness, could be they've become completely ineffective and the board wants to ease them out. But then it's found that the organization hasn't really done much succession planning. So ideally, I think managerial and executive development ought to actually feed into succession planning as well, because you know what you want from a manager or an executive, and you ought to be using that knowledge to develop your succession plans. So the real question is, as you're reading this slide, is my question at the bottom. How much of this do we expect the organization to provide, and how much of it do we expect executives to manage for themselves, right? And the other question is, how much of this do we expect them to have as we hire them? Their problem-solving skills, their initiative, their ability to function as a team player. So this really, in a more pronounced way, is a way of trying to integrate organizational strategic goals with individual strategic goals. So all of that, 35 minutes of talking, leads me to this discussion question that I want to ask for this week. And that the last paragraph has the question, which is, from the readings and from your own experience, do you think government and or nonprofit organizations, which means you don't have to talk about both, you can if you want, but just talk about one, do they invest in training as if it were a strategic imperative? What do you think about that in your experience and in your observation, I should say? It doesn't have to be your direct experience, but from your observation as well. Do we treat training as if it were a strategic imperative, which is the word I used to start this lecture? So that's where we're at this week. Again, housekeeping reminder, nothing in week 9 in terms of reading and lectures, but there is the Unit 2 summary due. Thank you very much.